All right, well, so we're in part 5 tonight. I got that right. Part 5. And I'm excited about tonight. I think this is going to be very interesting for you as you look into this very, very important and I'd say relevant book of the Bible. We have one more part left, part 6, and we'll complete the studies through Habakkuk, and then next week we're working on Zephaniah. So we're just going to carry on through the minor prophets as we have been doing for some time. All right, so let's get started tonight. So we're going to go through an introduction. I'm going to do a little review here. So God did answer Habakkuk's questions. So what you see in this book, Habakkuk, is you see a question and answer session with God. I'm pretty sure that this is a very unique situation in the Bible. I don't think there's another book in the Bible quite like this, where somebody's asking questions and getting answers. And so did God answer Habakkuk's questions? Yes, he did. So we're going to do a review of what we learned so far. So first of all, Habakkuk is a prophet, likely one who grew up in the surrounding of the royal court. We think he grew up in that surroundings. Nothing is known about his age or family background. During the height of his prophecy, godly King Josiah is on the throne. Habakkuk's nation, the southern kingdom of Judah, is having a superficial revival. By the way, Josiah was king for 31 years, and he was a godly man, probably one of the most godly of all the kings of Judah, next to David, of course. I think he would also rival Hezekiah. That was another godly king of Judah. But unfortunately, during the time of Josiah, the people had turned their backs on the Lord. So even though Josiah was completely right with God, the people were not. And so it was just a superficial revival. It's just they were giving lip service, but their hearts weren't right. And so Habakkuk knows this. He knows that people are just giving lip service to God, but their hearts aren't in it. And he knows that they're involved in sin, and he's not happy. So he talks to God about it. He cries out to God and brings a complaint. He says, he is complaining. Why, God, are you allowing this to happen? He says, you see the wickedness of the people. You see the crime and murder. You see the arguing and the fighting. You see the people ignoring your words. Kind of sounds like today a little bit, doesn't it? More than that a little bit. You see the miscarriage of justice. Why are you allowing this to happen? And people do this. People do this. People do this with me. They'll ask me these questions. And this man, Habakkuk, is asking this question. Why are you allowing this to happen? So God gives him his answer. His answer was, not long from now, my son, I'm going to allow the Babylonian Empire to come and chastise Judah for their sin. These Babylonians, they're cruel and heartless. So God starts to explain what the way they're being. He describes them as heartless beasts of prey. They will ravage the land and take everything, including many people, into captivity. Oh boy, I don't think Habakkuk was happy with that answer. No, he definitely wasn't. So he asked him a second question. And so the question basically is this: why them, Lord? How can it be them? Babylonians will destroy us. He knew very well what Babylonians were right. They'd already come into his land and ravaged it before. So he was aware of the Babylonians. The Babylonians will destroy us. They will leave nothing behind. They will never recover. We will never recover. We will never recover. And then he's like, they're evil, they're godless, they're heartless, they're cruel. They're also very wicked in their practices of idolatry. Every sin known to man is practiced by these Babylonians, by these people. You name it, they have done it. How could you use them, a very immoral people, to chastise Habakkuk's backslidden nation, yet not to the sinful level of these Babylonians. So he's saying, look, we're not as bad as these people. How can you use a very, very wicked nation to bring judgment to us who, yeah, we have problems, but we're not as bad as them? That's what he's saying. And God's answer is simple. The Babylonians have set themselves up to having a very, very short reign. And it's true. They didn't reign many years. Babylonians had a very short empire. I think it all told, I think it was about 200 years, maybe a little bit more. We need to keep in mind that when the 70-year captivity ended for Judah, Babylon had already fallen, and the Medo-Persia was now the empire in control. So, and you read about this in the book of Daniel. The Babylonians, Belshazzar fell in one night, and then Medo-Persia, King Cyrus came into control. So what was it that caused the Babylonians so much trouble? Well, God outlines 5 woes in chapter 2. And they are, I'll just give them to you. The 5 woes are the woe of looting and destruction of foes. That's the first woe. They were looting and destroying their foes. And so what will the foes do? Well, they will require revenge, and it won't be sweet for them. I mean, the Babylonians, it will be terrible. They're going to bring their hand upon them, bringing revenge because of how they were treated by the Babylonians. This is a woe. Second woe. The Babylonians were covetous, and they had a greed of property. So they would go into other nations and just take everything and take control of it. And these people are going to want it back. They're going to want it back. And they're going to kill them for it. So God says it's going to be a short reign for the Babylonians. Here's another woe. The woe of labor upon the backs of others. They're just living on the blood of other people. And those people that are put into that bad situation will want to free themselves. And then, of course, they're going to want revenge. They're going to want things back. They're going to attack the Babylonians, and they did. Then the next thing, he goes into the moral depravity of the Babylonians. The fourth woe is the woe of hedonism. Hedonism is a life of just frivolity. Somebody just gives himself to drugs and drunkenness and prostitution, immorality. And what does immorality do? Well, it will weaken families. It will weaken a nation. And that's what happened in Babylon because of its hedonism, because it got involved in all kinds of wickedness, i.e. drug use, drunkenness, prostitution, all this immorality going on, just throwing their lives to the wind. And so God said, that's it, And then the final woe is the woe of serving dumb idols. And of course, anything that isn't the Lord is just a dumb idol. And when I say dumb, I don't mean stupid. I mean one that cannot speak. It's dead. And so God's saying, look, your idols, you're imaginary. They're dead, Babylon. They're worthless in times of trouble. And people say, well, we don't worship idols of stone and gold and silver. Well, we don't sit down and worship statues, but modern idols such as success, love of money, people give themselves to success. They want to be successful, and they give their whole life to that. Love of money, Paul said that's the root of all kinds of evil. Fame, they want to be popular. Sex, they give themselves to that kind of wickedness. Possessions, they have to want to buy this and buy that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you say those are idols? Absolutely, they can be idols. And when I say people that want to give themselves to those type of things, and then they get sick, well, they can't pray to these things. They're not going to heal them from a disease or something. They're not going to help them when they go through difficulties. No, they're dead. They're imaginary. They're not even real. They may be real in the way of living there and living your life doing these things, but at the end of the day, they don't really help you. Only God can help you. And that's what he was saying. Babylon's going to destroy itself. And so Habakkuk, don't worry, your nation's not going to be destroyed, because you see, Babylon will eventually implode. And every empire and nation that follows this course, these 5 woes, will also bring destruction to themselves. So basically what I'm saying is people and nations and empires can make themselves into a Babylon, a type of Babylon. Immorality itself is a judgment, and those who continue to practice immorality are storing up wrath upon themselves from the Lord. You know, sometimes I think God withholds his judgment on people and lets them die an older life, because he's just allowing them to store up wrath on their own life. You know, if somebody lives an older life, you know, and they've just lived a wicked life, and they just live for sin and for self, then every day that they're living that immoral, wicked life, they're just storing up wrath for the judgment day and the eternal punishment of hell. And if they reject the gospel, it'll even be worse for them. So the idea is their day will come, rest assured. Babylon will end. So this idea, well, they're not going to be judged, and yes, they will be judged. And God knows exactly what they did, and they will answer for it. And so Habakkuk's people will survive and remain. Now, the question is, has this happened? Have you met any modern day Babylonians? Have you? No, you haven't. They're gone. They're in the dusty shelves of history books, and they're also found in archaeology digs, buried in the sands of time. Have you met any modern Israelis? Yes. Isn't that interesting that an ancient people called Israel has survived, whereas Babylon is gone, just as God said they would be? So Habakkuk now understands what God is doing, and so he bursts into a song of praise and prophetic prayer. And this is the theme of chapter 3. So now his questions have been answered, his 2 big questions, everything solved. All right, now it's time to praise the Lord. And that's what you have here in chapter 3. Very likely Habakkuk himself was a Levite, although we don't know that for sure, but it appears that he was, and was a singer in the court of King Josiah. There's no doubt that this man was a professional of some kind. He wasn't like Amos. You know, Amos was a farmer from Tekoa, and he left Tekoa and he went to the northern kingdom of Israel. But the man, he wasn't educated. Amos wasn't. And you'll find that even in the writings of the Word of God. I find that so interesting how the Bible can even go along with somebody's personality, or maybe even to what they've learned. And with Habakkuk, it is really intricate. In fact, what we find is Hebrew poetry throughout the book of Habakkuk. Now, you're never going to really understand Hebrew poetry when it's translated in English. But let me just say that Hebrew poetry isn't like what we have with poetry, where we rhyme words. That's where we get we rhyme words, and when we sing, we use poetry to sing. And if you ever notice, the Psalms are not really poetic in that way, but they are poetic. It's just not rhymes of words. It's rhymes of ideas and thoughts and things. They connect. And if you look carefully, even at the Psalms, you'll see a connection in the verses between things like sea and mountains and different other things like that. And they rhyme together. It's interesting how that works, but that's Hebrew poetry, and that's what you have in this song of praise and prophetic prayer. In fact, throughout the book of Habakkuk, you'll find poetry within it, but it's Hebrew poetry, of course, once again, not what we would consider poetry in our culture. Okay, let me give you a life application Bible note. Habakkuk praised God for answering his questions. Evil will not triumph forever. God is in control, and he can be completely trusted to vindicate those who are faithful to him. We must patiently wait for him to act. So this is what, God is sovereign. And when God works, we need to be patient with him. Sometimes we say, well, why aren't you working now, God? Why aren't you doing this, Lord? Well, you need to be patient. He's the one that's on the throne, not us. And so we need to let him work and do what he is supposed to do, or what he does. And I'll just read this verse 16 to you, but we're going to cover it next week in detail. It says, when I heard, my belly troubled, and my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he cometh up unto the people, he will invade them with his troops. So this is what he's saying in the end. He's saying, look, it's not my place to judge the Lord and to say, you need to do this now. That's God's area. We need to patiently wait for him to act. So now we're going to look at verse 1. So if you'll look at Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 1, we're going to start his song, his prayer of praise and prophecy. Habakkuk chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, upon Shigionoth. Shigionoth. What's a Shigionoth? All right, well, let me give you the definition of Shigionoth. The plural form Shigionoth is found in Habakkuk 3:1. The word denotes a lyrical poem composed under strong mental emotion, a song of impassioned imagination accompanied with suitable music, a dithyrambic ode, okay, dithyrambic ode. In other words, a wild choral hymn of ancient Greece. That's what that word means, dithyrambic. So what he's saying here is this is how this should be sung. It should be sung with a strong mental emotion, a song of impassioned imagination. This is how he wants us to sing it. If we were to sing it in Hebrew, this is how it was to be sung. And that word Shigionoth is also found in Psalms chapter 7, verse 1. This is in plural, that's in singular. And so it's a particular type of psalm. So this is a psalm. Habakkuk chapter 3 is a psalm. It is to be sung. The specific character of which is now not known, perhaps a wild, mournful ode. So however that was sung, there was a lot of emotion within the singing of it. And you'll see, because you see the verses are very powerful when it describes God and his essence. You'll see that and what God did in the past. We'll talk about that. So this is the reference that I received that from. Okay, now verse 2. O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of years. In the midst of years make known. In wrath remember mercy. It's a beautiful verse, isn't it? Let me give you the note on that. Habakkuk knew that God was going to discipline the people of Judah and that it wasn't going to be a pleasant experience. But Habakkuk accepted God's will, asking for help and mercy. Habakkuk did not ask to escape the discipline, but he accepted the truth that Judah needed to learn a lesson. God still disciplines in love to bring his children back to him. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5 and 6 talks about this. So if you get some time, have a look at that. Accept God's discipline gladly and ask him to help you to change. So God chastens his children. And so what's happening now in the life of Judah and in the life of southern Israel, in the life of Israel, is they're going to be chastised by the Lord, and God's going to use the Babylonians to bring this chastisement upon them. But look what he's saying here, in wrath remember mercy. So we'll talk about that. What he's doing in this verse is he is praying for revival. He's praying for the mercy of God. Notice that he isn't praying that God will revive his work, or he's not saying revive my work, or Habakkuk's work. He's saying revive your work, or God's work. Revive your work, God. Revive your work. When we pray for revival in this country, we're not praying for my work to be revived. We're praying for God's work. God has been working in this country for 2,000 years. Since Calvary, God has been at work in Britain, and he's still working in Britain. And so when we're praying for revival, we're not praying for our revival. We're praying for God's revival. We're praying, only God can revive. Revival is solely the work of God, not the achievement of man. God will not share in that. Man must cry out to God, and only God can do his spiritual work. Habakkuk complained when we meet him in chapter 1, don't we? We see that. We see this complaining coming from him. But when he found out what God would be bringing, he found out these Babylonians were coming, and this would not be good. It was time to cry out for mercy. He says, oh, Lord, please revive your work. Revive it in the midst of the years. You have been working for many hundreds of years with the people of Israel. Please revive us, Lord. Revive us. And Lord, you've been working for hundreds of years in this country with the people of this land. Lord, revive your work in the midst of years. That's what we ought to be praying. It's a beautiful request. And he's singing it. Spurgeon had some things to write about this verse. I'd like to give them to you. I just love these quotes from Spurgeon. Shake off all the bitterness of everything that has to do with self or with party, in other words, your group, and now pray, Lord, revive thy work, and if thy work happen to be more in one branch of the church than in another, Lord, give that the most reviving. It's not all about us, is it? It's about God reviving his work, wherever that is. Give us the blessing, but do let thine own purposes be accomplished and thine own glory come out of it. It's not about our glory, it's about his. And we shall be well content, though we should be forgotten and unknown. So forget us. That's what he's saying. He's saying, Lord, you do your work. We're nothing. We'll just be content that it's being done. That's what he's saying. What a humble statement. And I believe he meant it. Here's another statement from Spurgeon. Sorrowfully, not wishing to be an accuser of the brethren, it does seem to me that considering the responsibilities which were laid upon us and the means which God hath given us, the church generally, there are blessed exceptions, has done so little for Christ that if Ichabod, which means the glory is departed, were written right across its brow, and it were banished from God's house, in other words, he's talking about the whole of it, it would have its deserts or come back and, I don't know how, just deserts. We cannot therefore appeal to merit, it must be mercy. So it's not our merit that we appeal to, it's God's mercy. This is where Habakkuk is going. He's saying, please be merciful to us. We don't deserve it. That's why it's called mercy. Verse 3. God came from Teman. Now, Teman is a city in Edom, and it's to the east, southeast. And the Holy One from Mount Paran, also from the east, a mountain in the east, out in the Arabian area. And then it stops and it says, Selah. Of course, that's a rest. This is sung, but it means pause. It means rest. And it really means, when you see Selah, it really means stop and think about what you just read. That's really what it means. Think about it. And so God came from the east. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Well, that sounds like the second coming to me. And it is. Judgment comes from the east, though. Not just salvation, but both come from the east. Jesus said he will come from the east. But the Bible talks about an eastern wind, which was a wind of judgment. Salvation comes from the east. The temple and the tabernacle were eastern facing. If you go to Jerusalem today and you stand up on the Mount of Olives, you'll notice that the temple would have been facing the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives is to the east. It's the east of the Temple Mount. And the tabernacle was always, whenever they rested and stopped, when they were doing their journeys, the 40-year journeys, and when Israel was traveling to the promised land, when they rested the tabernacle, they always faced it to the east. Always. It was always eastern facing. The destroying locusts in Egypt came from the east. You can read that. You can read about that. So not only does God bring blessing from the east, but judgment also comes from the east. Also, Christ's second coming is from the east. So when Jesus comes again, he's going to come from the east. Judgment for the wicked and salvation to the righteous. So God will bring judgment from the east to the wicked, but he will also bring salvation to the righteous, and he'll bring it from the same location. And so look at our verse here, and you'll see it. God came from Edom, Teman, the east, the Holy One from Mount Paran. The Holy One, of course, is referring to Christ, and he is God. So look at here. It says, pause, rest, think about it. And then it says, his glory covereth the heavens, his earth was full of his praise. Well, this is talking about the earth and the heavens, or the universe, saying God wants to bring blessing. And when Christ comes to this earth, it will be a blessed time. So I believe this is a reference to the second coming of Christ. Let's look at the Life Application Bible note with this in mind. In these verses, Habakkuk paints the picture of God delivering his people out of Egypt in the dramatic Exodus. God's awesome power is not restricted to creating scenic wonders. He also uses it to execute righteousness and justice. It is not enough to be awed by God's power. We need to discipline in order to learn how to obey and live for him. So God is an awesome power, and it's not just enough to be awed by him. We also need to live a disciplined life to obey and live for him. That's the truth. Now let's look at verse 4. And his brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of his hands, and there was the hiding of his power. Now he's being symbolic here, but he's also seeing this in a vision. So Habakkuk did have visions, and this is obviously something that he's looking at, and he's describing it. Doesn't the Bible say in 1 John 1:5 that God is light? And look at the first part, and his brightness was as the light. So God is light. But then it talks about these horns coming out of his hand. And it doesn't say which hand it is, but I believe it is his right hand. And it speaks of his authority. Whenever you see horns in the Bible, it talks about authority. It talks about a ruling nation or an empire. And in this case, of course, the horns are coming out of the hand of God. And so this is, we're talking about God's authority over all the earth. God is teaching Habakkuk that he is sovereign. He is a sovereign authority of all the earth, and that he will take care of Habakkuk's people. He will bring judgment upon Babylon in due time, and everything will work out. It's interesting how his authority is presently hidden in many cases. This is where it says, and there was a hiding of his power. And so many times God's power is sort of in a mysterious way. We don't really see it directly. We sort of see it indirectly. But eventually the direct power of God will come out, and his authority will directly come out. When Jesus comes to rule and to reign on this earth, it will not be an indirect authority. It will be very direct, just as, you know, the government of Britain is direct in its authority. You watch the news, they say we have to do this, we have to do that. There's a direct authority there. And with God, we have what we read in his word, but it's sort of an indirect authority. But someday it will be direct. We will see it, and it will be right here on the earth. And so this is a reference, I believe, to the millennial reign of Christ. He's coming to rule and to reign. In Habakkuk's day, it looked like Babylon was the ultimate ruler. So he's looking at it in his time. You have to kind of look at it through this prophet's eyes. He doesn't see the way things are now. He doesn't live in this time. We live in this time. So he had a different culture, and he also had a different, there was a different dynamic back in those days. So Babylon was the ultimate ruler of his day, but really God is the ultimate ruler. And so even though the power looks like it's hiding, it's sort of indirect, it's there, and God will bring his hand of judgment upon these Babylonians. And you need to remember, you know, he's reminding Habakkuk of what he's done in the past. So this is verse 5. This is what it's about. So now he's going into the judgments upon Egypt. And many times in the prophecies, especially in the Old Testament, the people are always brought back to the deliverance from Egypt. And so this is where we're going now. Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. Wow. Who is like God? Who can stop him? Basically, that's where we're going. He's walking, and there's a pestilence before him, and he's walking among hot coals. Now, if there's a bunch of hot coals and I'm walking, I don't think I'm going to get that far walking on hot coals. But God can walk indefinitely on hot coals, no problem. And if there's a life-destroying disease, I don't think I'm going to walk into that. But God will do it. So what do you think can stop him? You think that can stop him? You think hot coals can stop God from moving? Do you think life-destroying disease is going to stop him? No. And so he delivered Habakkuk's people from the judgment of Egypt. You know, the pestilence is a reference of the plagues that hit the Egyptians. The locust was a pestilence. It's a pest. And they attacked the people. Do you think he can do it again? If he's done it before, can he do it again? That's the question. And the answer, of course, is rhetorically, yes. If he's done it before, he can do it again. Now let's look at verse 6. He stood and measured the earth. Now when God's measuring the earth, he's showing ownership. That's what he's doing. He says, I own this planet. And I submit, if the Prime Minister want to listen to this this later on, can I just tell you, sir, who owns the planet? And it's not you, it's God. And let me also speak to the President of America. You don't own the world. God owns it. And any other, I don't care if it's the Premier of China or the leader of Russia. I don't care who he is or she. God is owner of this planet. He measures the earth. And someday he's going to come and he's going to claim ownership directly. And so he says, he stood and measured the earth. Notice it's in the past tense. That's interesting. He beheld and drove asunder the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered, and the perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. And I believe he's being metaphorical about the mountains and the hills. So let me explain that to you. See, no one can stand in his way. Remember, he's talking about walking on hot coals. He's talking about walking through pestilence and just keeping going, not stopping. No one can stand in God's way. God is all powerful. His word and his work will be fulfilled no matter what mankind tries to do to stop him. The everlasting mountains and the perpetual hills. So if somebody wants to be a mountain, maybe they're not as authoritative as a mountain, so they're a perpetual hill, and they just say, well, we're always going to be here. Well, no, they're not. Everyone will be scattered and will bow before him. God is everlasting. His plan will see fulfillment. New Testament. Romans chapter 14, verse 10 and 11. But why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set it not thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, and this is talking about Jesus, he says, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. And by the way, let me just tell you that that's a really good verse for the deity of Christ, because he's Lord, and he's also God. And I find that so fascinating. And so every knee means every knee. Does that mean people who have shamed him and blamed him or slandered him or said all kinds of evil against him will bow to him someday? It says it right there. Now look at verse 7. I saw the tents of Cushan, which Cushan is referring to Africa, and in this case, this is referring to Egypt. So he says, I saw the tents of Cushan, or Egypt, in affliction. So they weren't doing too well. And the curtains of the land of Midian. Now, the Midianites, Moses actually married a Midianite, Zipporah, but she was actually a Kenite. So if you ever see Kenites in Scripture, that's the family of Zipporah, Moses's wife, and so the leader of the Kenites was his father-in-law. And it says here, the land of Midian did tremble. This is referring to the parting of the Red Sea and the plagues of Egypt. Interesting to notice that the houses of the Egyptians were called tents, and the tents of Midian, the Midianites were they were people, they were nomadic people, and many of them were sheep herders, or they had cattle, or they were traders of some kind. Those were Midianites, and so they lived in tents. And so he calls the houses of the Egyptians tents, and he calls the tents of Midian, he calls them curtains. And so what he's doing here, this is a reference to life. It's temporary. The house that you are in right now is a temporary structure. The house that I'm sitting in right now is only temporary. And we need to understand that. And the houses of the Egyptians, they no longer live in their houses. Their houses are gone. So they were like tents. They just put them up for a couple hundred years or however long that lasted, and then they were gone. And that's the way it is. Life is temporary. God is reminding Habakkuk that he did afflict and deliver his people from Egypt during the Exodus, and those accounts frightened the Midianites. Of course it did. You think it did? I mean, when God parted the Red Sea and brought all those judgments upon the Egyptians, don't you think that the Midianites did tremble with that? They would have heard the stories. They would have heard the accounts. They would have known. And the Egyptians were definitely afflicted. So that's what that's referring to. All right, now let's look at verse 8. We're almost done. We got a few more verses left. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? And was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? that thou didst ride upon thy horses and thy chariots of salvation. What's this mean? Well, this is God asking the question. Was it hard for the Lord to stop the river and divide the sea? Was it hard? I mean, when God stopped the river Jordan, when they crossed the river Jordan with Joshua, was that hard? No, it wasn't. And by the way, the Jordan also had tributaries. It didn't just have the Jordan River. There were tributaries that flow into the Jordan that were also stopped on that day. So that's interesting, isn't it? And then it says, and was thy wrath against the sea? And then it says, and thou didst ride upon thine horses, or Israel, and thy chariots of salvation. So what he's saying here is being metaphorical here, of course. A lot of this is metaphorical, but the question is, was it hard for the Lord to stop the river and divide the sea? Was it hard? No, of course not. That's rhetorical. Did Habakkuk do that? Did he divide the sea? Did he stop the rivers? No. God did it with so much ease that it was like riding a chariot of deliverance. So he gives this metaphor, this comparison, that it's so easy for God and so easy to deliver them. And it was just like putting them on a horse and a chariot or like a cart of some kind and carry them across that expanse. There was not a problem with God. It was easy. So God can take care of Habakkuk. He's giving examples of his deliverance in the past in this song. Okay, now verse 9. Thy bow was made quite naked, according to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word, Selah. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. So now Habakkuk is talking directly to God in this verse. The naked bow is a saying of the ease of deliverance. Many times in the Bible you'll find old Hebrew sayings and the naked bow of deliverance. It's just the ease. It's just God says, I have my bow out and it's been taken out. Everybody can see it. It's naked because it's visible. Everybody can see it. It's just ease. I'm just going to put my arrows in it and start shooting and take care of you. And he's saying that God's deliverance of Israel was so easy and complete according to the oath of God. Remember, whenever God makes an oath, it's eternally binding. And so that's in the verse. The last phrase might be a reference to the flood of Noah, or it might simply refer to the river system of the earth according to God's design. He said that was also easy. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. So does that mean the flood? Could be. Does it mean simply that God divides rivers? Yes, it does. And now our final verse. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. Boy, it's interesting how people, they hear about the Lord, but they won't fear him. But when the mountains see him, they tremble. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his hands on high. Once again, we see the description of the power of the Lord, who is awesome. There's no real word in the English language that can really give credit to this. And so we have to use this word. It's kind of the modern word, awesome. There's no way you can really describe the power of the Lord. You say the power of the Lord, and you say it's undescribable. It's indescribable. God works among the nations, fulfilling his word. Many times he works behind the scene, but his purpose and plan will be fulfilled. Every last prophecy will be honored. Nothing will be left undone. Many times people think that because we don't see God's hand working visibly, that he either is unconcerned or he simply doesn't exist. What people forget is that if God were to do what was written in verse 10, we would be destroyed. So by his mercy, he works in the background, fulfilling his plan. He makes the mountains to shake. The seas come up and worship him. It's just it's talking about the hand of nature that no one can control, only God. So by his mercy, he works in the background, fulfilling his plan. There will be a day when he comes out in the open to complete his work. Until that day, let us trust his plan for our life and obey his word. So this is, as you see it unfold, you'll see this is describing God in awesome terms beyond anything we can comprehend. And so in the end, you're going to find Habakkuk next week overwhelmed with this. He'll be overwhelmed.